She walked into that bank like she owned it, not because of arrogance, because she'd already owned everything that mattered. The teller looked at her, really looked, and made a choice that would echo through every decision she'd ever made as a black woman in spaces that weren't built for her. You know that moment? When someone sees you and decides who you are before you even open your mouth? This isn't a story about what happened. It's about what she already knew about herself before anyone else figured it out. Stay with me, because what happened next isn't what you think. She didn't walk into that bank thinking about her accomplishments. That's not how we move through the world, is it? We carry our credentials like a secret we're afraid to tell. We know what we've built. We know the sleepless nights. We know the decisions we made that nobody else would have made. But there's something about stepping into spaces where people see your skin before they see your resume. The teller's name was Marcus. He'd worked there for 7 years. 7 years of watching people come and go. 7 years of processing withdrawals, deposits, the mundane rhythm of other people's money flowing through his hands. But he had developed something that most people develop after years of repetition. He'd learned to read people, not in a mystical way, in that human way, the way you learn when you're paying attention. She approached his window. No hurry, no performance. Just a woman who needed to withdraw money from her account. Nothing spectacular about the moment. Nothing that would normally make anyone stop and remember. But Marcus did something that morning that would reveal everything about what was about to happen. He looked at her, and something in his face changed. You know that look, when someone sees you and their entire expression shifts. Not disrespect, not disdain. It was something else, something closer to recognition. The kind of recognition that comes when you see someone who doesn't belong in the place they're standing, but carries themselves like they own it, like they've already made peace with the contradiction. She placed her request on the counter, a withdrawal, a substantial one, the kind of withdrawal that makes tellers pause, not because it's unusual, but because it matters, because it reveals something about the person standing in front of you. Marcus looked at the amount. Then he looked back at her. And then he did what tellers are supposed to do. He asked for identification. But the way he asked, the pause before the question, the slight hesitation, these were the things that mattered. These were the things that told the real story. She reached for her wallet, not with frustration, not with the resignation of someone who's been asked 1,000 times before. She moved like someone who'd been waiting for this moment, like she understood exactly what was about to happen. She opened her wallet and pulled out her ID, but it wasn't the ID he expected to see. It was her CEO identification card, not a corporate badge. Not some sleek piece of plastic with a title printed on it, a legitimate official identification that said exactly who she was and what she'd built. Marcus's face didn't change, but something shifted behind his eyes. The kind of shift that happens when someone realizes they've made an assumption and the person standing in front of them has just demolished it without saying a word. She didn't smile. She didn't make it easy for him. She simply held the card where he could see it, and that's when something extraordinary happened. Something that had nothing to do with the money. Marcus looked at that ID. He looked at her, and without a word, he began to speak about what he saw. Not about the withdrawal, about her, about what it meant, what it took. Because here's what people don't understand about these moments. They're not about proving yourself. They're about the moment when the world catches up to what you already knew about yourself. It's the difference between being defended and being seen. She'd walked into that bank carrying something that most people never get to carry. Not arrogance, authority. The kind that comes from surviving rooms where you weren't supposed to be. The kind that comes from making decisions when everyone else was quiet. The kind that comes from knowing that your voice matters because you've made it matter through every single choice you've ever made. Marcus dropped to his knees. Not literally, not in some dramatic performance, but in that moment, something about his entire being acknowledged what he was looking at. A black woman, a CEO in a bank, on an ordinary Tuesday, doing an ordinary thing, and carrying within that ordinary moment an entire universe of extraordinary decisions that had led her to that window, to that teller, to that ID card. And his colleagues saw it. They came over. They looked at the ID, and they understood. This wasn't about a withdrawal being denied. This was about the weight of showing up as yourself in spaces that were never designed for you. This was about the exhaustion of being questioned. This was about the moment when you don't have to explain anything because your work speaks louder than any explanation ever could. But here's what's really important about this story. What matters isn't what happened in that bank. It's what she already knew before she walked in. You see, there's a thing about being a black woman in leadership that nobody really talks about in the motivational speeches. They talk about breaking glass ceilings. They talk about representation. They talk about doors opening. But what they don't talk about is the weight of knowing that every single time you enter a room, you're carrying the proof. The proof that you belong. The proof that you're qualified. The proof that you're not a mistake. This woman had already carried that weight for years. She'd made decisions that shaped industries. She'd built teams. She'd navigated rooms where people looked at her and saw a secretary before they saw a CEO. She'd smiled through meetings where her ideas were repeated back to her by men who suddenly got credit. She'd learned to speak in a certain way, dress in ascertain way, exist in a certain way that made people comfortable enough to let her stay. And the teller asking for identification wasn't unusual. It was routine. It was normal. It was the kind of thing that happens to people every single day. But the weight of it, the weight of having to prove again that you have the right to access what's already yours. That's the thing nobody talks about. Because here's what most people don't understand about these moments. They're not about whether she could withdraw the money. Of course she could. It was her account. It was her money. The question was never about legitimacy. The question was about whether she would have to explain it. And when she showed that ID card, she wasn't just showing credentials. She was showing something deeper. She was showing that she'd refused to shrink. She'd refused to apologize for taking up space. She'd refused to play small so that other people could feel comfortable. And somewhere along the way, she'd built something so undeniable that even a bank teller, just a regular person doing his job, had to pause and recognize it. That's not about the withdrawal. That's about the journey that led to that moment. Think about the years it took. Think about the decisions. Think about the times she had to believe in herself when nobody else was watching. Think about the moment she decided that being a CEO wasn't something that happened to her. It was something she would create by herself, on her own terms. And then she walked into a bank on an ordinary Tuesday and showed her ID. The rest of the world caught up. But let me tell you something about that moment in the bank. Something that most people miss when they hear this story. It wasn't about the teller being moved. It wasn't about him dropping to his knees in some dramatic display of emotion. That's the surface reading. That's what people share on social media and call inspirational. But the real story is quieter than that. And it's also much deeper, because what actually happened was a shift in recognition. Marcus looked at that ID card and something clicked, not because she suddenly deserved respect. She'd always deserved respect, but because in that moment, the proof was undeniable. The evidence was there. She didn't just belong in that bank. She led organizations. She made decisions that affected thousands of people. She existed in a space that most people don't get to occupy, and that changed something in the room. You know what's interesting about being a black woman in corporate America? You develop a kind of radar. You learn to sense the moment when someone's perception of you shifts. You feel it in the air. You see it in their eyes. It's the moment when they stop seeing you as a potential threat or a curiosity, and they start seeing you as someone who knows something they don't. That's what happened with Marcus. But here's what's really important about this. The moment didn't validate her. She didn't need Marcus to validate her. She was already validated by the years of work, by the decisions she'd made when it was hard, by the times she'd spoken up in rooms where her voice wasn't expected, by the nights she'd worked while other people slept. She was validated by the life she'd built. What the moment did was create a mirror. It showed her something about the world she'd been moving through. It showed her that sometimes when you refuse to shrink, when you keep showing up as your full self, the world eventually has to acknowledge it. Not because the world suddenly becomes fair, not because racism disappears or because corporate structures change overnight, but because you become so undeniable that people have to reckon with you, even if it's just for a moment, even if it's just a teller in a bank on a Tuesday morning. And maybe that's the real lesson here. It's not about the withdrawal. It's not about the ID card. It's about the journey that made her the kind of woman who could show up, be questioned. Andre spawned with the quiet confidence of someone who's already done the work. Let me tell you something about the spaces where black women lead. They're not the same spaces they were 10 years ago, not because the world suddenly became enlightened, but because women like her refuse to disappear into the background. They refuse to be the diversity hire. They refuse to smile their way through disrespect. They refuse to shrink, and that refusal changed everything. Because here's what happens when you show up as a black woman in corporate spaces. You're not just representing yourself. You're carrying the weight of every woman who came before you, the ones who cleaned those offices, the ones who answered phones, the ones who were never asked what they thought because their opinions didn't matter in the space they occupied. You're carrying all of that, but you're also carrying something else. You're carrying the future. The girls who are watching, the women who are wondering if it's possible, the ones who are sitting in rooms right now, staying quiet, waiting to see if someone who looks like them will stand up and claim the space. When she walked into that bank and showed her ID, she wasn't just processing a withdrawal. She was showing every black woman who might hear this story that the journey is possible. Not easy, never easy, but possible. And that's the thing that Marcus understood in that moment. He wasn't moved because she was exceptional. He was moved because she was real, because she'd actually done the work, because the proof was right there in her hands. You know what's interesting about proof? It doesn't require permission. It doesn't need anyone's validation. It just exists. And once it exists, people have to reckon with it. She'd built something that couldn't be ignored, not because it was flashy or loud, but because it was real, because it had substance, because behind that CEO card was years of decisions, risks, late nights, and the kind of courage that most people never develop because they never have to. And when she showed that ID, something shifted in that bank, not just for Marcus, for everyone who was there, because suddenly the story changed. It wasn't about a black woman trying to access her own money. It was about a CEO, a leader, someone who'd already proven what she was capable of doing. The distinction matters, not because one story is more important than the other, but because it shows you something about how the world works, how perception shifts when you refuse to be perceived as small. Listen, if you're here with me at this point in the video, I want to invite you to subscribe to this channel. Not because I'm asking for a favor, but because if this story resonated with you, there are more stories like this waiting for you. Stories about women who showed up. Stories about the quiet power of refusing to disappear. Stories about the moments when the world finally catches up to what you already knew about yourself. And I want you to be here for those stories. So, subscribe. Follow along every single day, because these are the narratives that matter. Theonas that don't get told in the corporate training videos or the motivational seminars. The ones that belong to us. You know something? The thing about that moment in the bank isn't really about the teller dropping to his knees. It's about what it represents. It represents the moment when exhaustion becomes clarity. When you stop waiting for permission and you realize you never needed it in the first place. Because here's what most people don't understand about Black women in leadership. We're not looking for applause. We're not looking for someone to finally see us and validate our existence. We're moving forward because we have to. Because there are people depending on our decisions. Because we've already made peace with the fact that the world wasn't built for us. So we're building something within it anyway. And that's what she was doing when she walked into that bank. She wasn't seeking recognition. She was just processing a withdrawal. But the weight of everything she'd built was there. The weight of every decision, every late night, every time she had to speak up in a room where her voice wasn't expected, every time she chose to stay when staying washer than leaving, and when she showed that ID card, something shifted. Not because the world suddenly understood her value, but because she'd already proven it to herself. And that's the only proof that ever really matters. The bank became a mirror of a journey that had already been completed long before that moment. The story doesn't end in that bank. It ends inside her because that moment wasn't about vindication. It wasn't about finally being seen. It was about the quiet confirmation of something she'd already built. The confirmation that when you refuse to disappear, when you keep showing up as your complete self, the world eventually has to make space. Not because the world changes, but because you've already changed what's possible within it. She didn't need that teller to validate her. But his response showed her something about the power of consistency, the power of showing up day after day, making decisions that matter, speaking in rooms where your voice wasn't invited, and refusing to shrink when the pressure got heavy. That's what the CEO card meant. It wasn't a badge of honor. It was a statement, a quiet, undeniable statement that said, I did this. I built this. I made this real. And somewhere in that bank, Marcus understood, not because he suddenly became enlightened, but because he saw proof. Real proof. The kind that can't be argued with or explained away. This is what I want you to hold on to. Not the moment in the bank, but the years that led to it, the countless decisions, the times you doubted yourself and moved forward anyway, the conversations you didn't have because you knew it wouldn't matter, the nights you worked while others slept, the rooms where you stayed quiet because staying was harder than leaving. All of that led to that moment. And that moment was just confirmation of what you already knew. So if you're watching this and you're a Black woman trying to make space for yourself in spaces that weren't built for you, know this: the proof you're building right now matters. Every decision, every time you show up, every time you refuse to play small, you're building something that can't be ignored. You don't need anyone to see it first. You just need to see it in yourself. And when the world finally catches up, and it will, you'll realize it already happened long before anyone else noticed. Thank you for being here, for staying with me through this story, for understanding what really matters. Subscribe. Share this with 5 people who need to hear it. Leave a comment and tell me what you're building. Tell me what brought you here today. Tell me what story you want to hear next. Because these conversations matter. Your voice matters, and I'll be here every single day telling the stories that belong to us.